You are listening to the Empowering Working Moms podcast, Real Talk with Dr. Priyanka Nayak, a show to help professional moms in survival mode to take hold of their lives and thrive. If you're ready to take powerful action to create your best life, then this is the show for you. I'm your host, Dr. Priyanka Nayak, board-certified internal medicine physician and certified life coach. Now let's get to it and dive in. You are listening to the Empowering Working Moms podcast, episode number 16. Hello, I am so happy to have you listening in today. It's summertime and boy, oh boy, has it been hot. Although for me personally, I love the summer heat. Those of you who don't, I hope you're staying cool. Today, I am going to talk about a topic that has had increased awareness in the mental health circuits, the topic of narcissism. And I know that many of us may or may not be familiar with this term, so I'm going to define it. And also, once you figure out what narcissism is, or if somebody has narcissistic tendencies, I will give you tools and tips on how to deal with them. So let's dive in. Some people are diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, which is an axis 2 disorder. Many of the axis 2 disorders require therapy and there is no medication for them, as opposed to axis 1 disorders like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Those have actual medications that can help. So in terms of narcissistic personality disorder, I want to talk about narcissism because somebody you know who is close to you may have characteristics and traits. So it's good to familiarize yourself with these characteristics. That way, you're able to identify what is happening, get distance from what's happening, and then employ the tools I talk about to make life more manageable, livable, and peaceful for yourself. Here are some signs of narcissism. The world revolves around them, their perspective, their feelings, what is happening to them. They often have a sense of entitlement as well as lacking empathy, particularly for you. So they will victimize themselves. They're the victims. They often need excessive admiration. They may be arrogant. And again, they will not really subscribe or buy into what your perspective or your plight may be. In parents, often you end up being an extension of your narcissistic parent. And people will say, oh, my children are an extension of me. Well, this is not a fact, okay? We are separate people from our parents. We are also separate people from our children. In childhood, there's often a focus on competition and success, and this will breed narcissism. It can be genetic as well, but combined with a lack of psychological and emotional attachment to a parent, and essentially a child's needs are not met, they feel unimportant, they feel disconnected from their parents or other people, they may have trauma, unreliable or unpredictable parental caregiving, or they may be the recipients of excessive praise or excessive criticism growing up. I want to help give you distance from anyone narcissistic in your life because narcissists often manipulate, gaslight, and blame shift. Now, I'm going to go over these terms so that you can get familiar with them. When you're in the deep, deep, dark web of narcissism, it is really hard to see clearly and see these labels that are happening. So by learning about narcissism, learning about their tactics, you can start to build distance between you and that person or their manipulation. And no longer will you get sucked in to the toxicity. Because narcissists will often make you feel like you are crazy when they actually have a skewed sense of reality, one that they create and one that they believe as well. And then they'll have you believing all the things and questioning what you're thinking. So let's dive into the terms. Manipulation. I think we're familiar with this term, right? Basically, controlling or playing upon unfair or insidious means, manipulating people to one's own advantage. A narcissist may drop certain statements to elicit a response from you, be it insults or to try and get you to do something. And the more aware you are of this process, the more you're aware that the narcissist does this, the more you can combat this. Awareness is truly key in the process of creating peace in your life. And I've talked about awareness on previous episodes. Once you're aware, you can sit with that, and then you don't have to get sucked in. You don't have to subscribe to the narcissistic manipulation or story. You must keep practicing this, though, okay? It's not going to happen overnight. It takes time. And when we are used to dysfunction, when we grow up in dysfunctional homes, and maybe we don't even realize it because whatever happens to us as children, we think is normal, whether it is or whether it isn't. So often, there is a pull. There is a very, very strong pull to participate in dysfunction. But as we learn what narcissism is, as we are aware and acknowledge that pull, we can work towards keeping ourselves standing straight and standing high. Gaslighting. I'm sure everyone's familiar with this, but if you're not, I'm going to define it for you. So, narcissists are so good at gaslighting. Addicts and alcoholics are excellent at gaslighting as well, especially when it comes to their using. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which the abuser attempts to sow self-doubt and confusion in their victim's mind. Gaslighters seek to gain power, control, somewhat over themselves and, of course, the other person as well. They lie and distort reality, forcing the other person to question his or her own judgment and intuition. For example, in an argument, you may have told the person who is gaslighting you XYZ the other day. However, they will flat out tell you that you never told them that. They do this to maintain their own sense of power in an argument. They don't want to take the blame. So you may start to question, wait a second, did I tell this person XYZ? As you're doing this, you can begin to acknowledge that perhaps you're getting gaslit. So knowing this, you can decide. See, because deciding gives us the power, we get to decide. It's not that someone is controlling how we're reacting. So you can decide not to fight back, not to waste your energy on proving your point, because you're never going to prove it with a narcissist. Most narcissists are not interested in getting help. They don't want to go to therapy. They don't even know they have a problem, and they are not going to change. Realizing this is empowering because, again, you get to decide how you are going to handle him or her. You can decide not to engage in arguments, not to try and prove a point. You can realize that you're getting gaslit and realize that you're not crazy, that you're not hallucinating, that you told them something when they're telling you it's a lie. Once you have your awareness heightened, you can decide to not participate as much. Now remember, this will probably drive the narcissist crazy, and he or she will try to perturb you to get a rise out of you even more. He or she probably knows how to push your buttons and will continue to do it. So it's up to you to decide how you want to handle it, to not get involved, to walk away, maybe even to participate if you decide that, which in my opinion is not a good idea, or perhaps to cut this person out of your life if possible. Similarly, addicts gaslight about using. Alcoholics will hide alcohol or be visibly drunk and deny drinking to the point where you may question your own instincts. Remember to trust your gut and not to let them shake you. And dissociate. Dissociate to create space between you and them and their disease. Now I want to address the topic of blame shifting. Narcissists tend to be blameless, meaning nothing is ever their fault. But instead, it's the people and the circumstances around them that are to blame. This happens in addiction as well. For example, alcoholics will blame their drinking on a trigger, i.e., flying airplanes is anxiety-inducing for me and that's why I drink. Well, you drink because you choose to drink. The flying is just an excuse. See the blame shifting on the circumstance and not taking responsibility. A narcissist will take minimal responsibility and often don't follow through on their promises. They will blame you that you didn't explain properly or some other reason, that you're to blame in the end. They may say this outright or in a more circuitous way. Instead of taking the blame on and feeling bad about yourself, you can choose to see it for what it is. See, you get to choose, you get to decide. You are not powerless, you are empowered. You choose and you can see clearly. So when you see clearly and you're aware, you get to be present with that. Notice it, neutralize it, and then decide what you're going to do. Once you decide what you're going to do, you can then take action. This is my model of dealing with any and all tense situations. I encourage you to write this down and try it. Once we are aware of blame shifting, we can neutralize it and take its power over us away. Then we are empowered. See how this works? This way of life allows us to break the cycle, perhaps unhealthy cycles we have engaged in for a very long time. And as we learn to be aware and break this cycle, we have the opportunity to pave a new way, distance ourselves from getting sucked in to old unhealthy patterns. And this process is how we create peace, freedom, and strength. Sometimes we end up in a place in life where we think to ourselves, how did I get here? Well, you did have something to do with it, but I don't want you to take on a blaming attitude towards yourself. It's an awareness of owning how we got where we are today. That's the approach. To understand and give ourselves compassion. I want you to think about your childhood. Were your core needs met? Did you feel loved unconditionally? A client of mine realized that her mother was a narcissist. Growing up in that atmosphere is very unhealthy. She never felt good enough. Everything was always her fault. Her mother would stop talking to her for months at a time. In her 20s, she did this for silly reasons like, quote unquote, being disrespectful. Now she realizes, my client, that all of these behaviors that her mother exhibited were power plays. She now realizes how unhealthy that was. She went on to marry a narcissist as well. He was great on paper, super charming, made her feel loved. He sucked her in and then began to abuse her mentally and physically. She realized several years into her relationship with him that he had been hiding his alcoholism from her. And at that moment, everything clicked. She learned about her own codependent tendencies as taught to her by her narcissistic mother. My client was always responsible for her own mother's happiness via whatever she did in her life. She was responsible for her mother's feelings. Her mother would often say, Your problems are my problems, or why are you doing this to me? When she would complain about her husband to her mother would talk about how much her mother was struggling because her daughter was having trouble, because her daughter was getting abused. It was affecting her. It was all about her mother, the narcissist. So, of course, my client would feel guilty. She'd feel guilty about everything. Her spouse, of course, was blaming her for everything, blaming her for his alcoholism. And she would often try to control the situation, control things outside of her, which, as we know, she had no control. But she would try and control things by walking on eggshells in hopes that her spouse wouldn't abuse her. She would give ultimatums about his drinking in hopes that he would stop. And none of this would work. In fact, she only felt frustrated and miserable. So you're probably wondering, where is the story going? This is pretty sad. Well, there is a happy ending here, so keep listening. Once we started working together, she began to understand what codependence was. She no longer wanted to function that way with her mom or her spouse, so she got to decide. She then began to create boundaries, meaning if X happens, then I do Y. She would tell her spouse, if you abuse me, I will leave the house. She felt empowered. She had a plan. She also relinquished any and all responsibility over his drinking. He would abuse her in spurts. Leaving felt overwhelming. But as she learned through coaching with me to love herself and make clean decisions, things became clearer and clearer. When at one point for a very long time, not at one point, when for so long, they had been so confusing. She was back and forth about whether to leave or whether to stay. She was spinning all the time. But with coaching, she practiced and learned and began to truly love herself, something she had never done before. She learned to self-love by asking herself, what would I do if I loved myself? So I encourage you to do the same. Because if self-love sounds corny to you, I know it used to sound corny to me. And it took a lot of practice, even for myself, to start learning to love me before I was trying to love everyone around me. So she would ask herself, if I love myself, would I keep putting myself in harm's way? The answer was no. So she created a boundary for herself. So take that in. The boundary has to do with her, not him. So when you create a boundary, it's about you, not the other person. You're empowered because you are controlling what you can control. That's what happens to you, what you do with yourself. She did let him know what her boundary was. She told him, if you abuse me one more time, I am pretty sure I am going to get off this endless roller coaster ride. He did physically abuse her, and she left. She filed for divorce about a year later. She told me that without coaching, it would have taken her years to get clarity and finally leave. She said she would have stayed in her marriage probably for another decade. Once she did move out and no longer lived with him, she felt that the air was lighter and she could get the clarity on the relationship that she needed. She was too enmeshed with him when she lived with him, and she could not see clearly, she says. Now, she's never been happier. She is truly living her best life, even though at one point she had no idea how the hell she was going to get there. So if you have a narcissist in your life, here are some tips on how to deal with it. First, learn about narcissism. Google it, listen to this at the beginning of this episode. Have labels for what they do, like the manipulation, gaslighting, blame shifting, because once you can put a label on it, You can get some distance from it and not get as sucked in. When you feel you're being lied to the point where you're questioning your own reality, ask yourself if you're being gaslit. All of this is empowering. Have some sentences and statements in your back pocket that you can use when you're talking to said narcissist. For example, I hear you. Or we can agree to disagree. Or I'm not going to engage in this argument. Have a plan. If a narcissist starts raging at you, decide that you're going to walk out of the room. So create your own boundary. And you don't necessarily have to tell this person what your boundary is. It's really just for you. Give yourself compassion. The narcissist may try to blame you for everything, and you may find yourself wanting to fix him or her and also take on the blame. But I promise you, it's not your fault. Focus on maintaining your own peace and taking care of yourself. Take time to yourself and get space when you need it. Let go of your need for him or her to see things your way, because it's probably not going to happen. Actively decide not to take what the narcissist says seriously or personally. This one is huge. It will save you a lot of heartache. Love and accept yourself as you are. And if you're wondering how to do that, listen to episode number 11, where I talk about practicing self-love for inner peace. Physically remove yourself from tantrums. Know that you cannot change anyone except for yourself, including the narcissist in your life. You cannot change him or her. Connect with yourself and learn to love yourself, keeping yourself safe above all else. This will help naturally guide you with the narcissist. These tools I've discussed today will help to unconfuse you, to keep you from going back and forth again and again, to keep you from spinning, and to help you to get clarity and eventually peace. If you are having problems similar to the client's problems I mentioned today, get in touch with me to talk and come up with a plan to move through this mental exhaustion and to get to a lighter, free, more confident place. And please keep yourself safe no matter what. If you are a professional mom in survival mode and want to move through mental exhaustion, get out of a toxic relationship or job, and feel confident and in control of your life, get in touch with me for a free 30-minute consultation call to see what's possible. www.priyankanayakmdcoaching.as.me, link in the show notes, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Empowering Working Moms podcast, Real Talk with Dr. Priyanka Nayak. If you are ready to get unstuck and out of survival mode to live your best life, I want to invite you to book a free 30-minute consultation call with me. To get started, visit priyankanayakmdcoaching.as.me. Link in the show notes.